Darling one, you were born from the sweetest love, cast from the fires of creation, burning bright into the making of your perfect constellations. Head high, my love, never let them diminish you. Stand tall in the power of your love. Break open to the thousands come before you, written in your heart with holy blood. Keep going, my love. Hold tight to the scripture of your inheritance, your dreams born from ancient stone. Weave your magic star of wisdom, breathing life into hollow bones. Courage, my love. Place pain upon your sacred altars. Grow seeds where life has become hopeless. Lend hands to those who fall and falter. Let love be life's greatest opus. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tara Brading, and I'm the creator of the Dreaming the Ancestors podcast series, where we talk about remembering and reclaiming ancestral stories, feminine wisdom, and earth magic. This is the first episode, and for those of you who are listening to this podcast for the first time, I'll share just a few words about myself and my intention for this podcast series. I'm an ancestral educator and guide, and I specialize in sharing wisdom from Ireland and England. I've been on a journey of remembering and reclamation for over 15 years, honoring the earth-based feminine wisdom left in my blood and bones. I believe that this wisdom is awakening inside so many of us in these times of transformation and change, and my greatest passion is connecting women to the wisdom of their ancestors. I've trained as a women's Moon Circle facilitator with Karen Ward, Moon based in Dublin, Ireland. I've also studied Irish sean-nós singing and keening with Mary McLaughlin, and I'm learning Irish Gaeilge with MF Learning. And one of my biggest intentions for this podcast series is to uplift the voices of native wisdom keepers from Ireland and Britain who lovingly hold this ancestral wisdom in the palms of their hands. And so to begin this podcast series, I'm so thrilled to introduce you to my mentor, Mary McLaughlin, and we're going to have a meaningful conversation about sacred song traditions from Ireland. Born in Northern Ireland, Mary McLaughlin's early musical influences included Latin chant and Donegal sean-nós singing. She spent the first part of her adult life in London, where she developed as a vocal teacher, songwriter, arranger, and recording artist. Working on the British folk scene, she was exposed to the traditional music of England and Scotland, all of which helped shape her musically. A 1995 Billboard chart success with Celtic Voices, a compilation album on which she sang the first 3 songs, brought her original songs and arrangements to the USA market, and she moved to California in 1997. Subsequently, working and touring with many leading Irish and American musicians, she established herself as a performer and teacher throughout the US. Between 1999 and 2012, she published 2 Irish-language songbooks and 4 albums, and was the founder-arranger of the Californian Gaelic choir Chor and Glee. In addition, she was signed by Windham Hill Sony to produce Celtic Requiem, which spawned many tracks on various albums of the Celtic variety. Alongside her performance career, she has had a career in academia and teaching. She holds a PhD in Irish traditional song studies, an MA in ritual studies and chant, specializing in the Irish keen, certificates in sound healing, shamanism, vocal and general education, and has taught both at school and university level, as well as running workshops and online classes in Irish song and singing. Mary, I'd love to just bring you on for a moment just to say hello to everyone.
Hi there. I was listening to that bio and thinking, how did I manage to do all that? That's 100 years worth of work.
You have so much experience, Mary. So much experience, and it's so wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Very much for inviting me.
So I'd like to take this moment now just to close our eyes and imagine that we are having this conversation in the flesh, heart to heart, and that we're sitting around a great fire upon the earth, And we're sharing wisdom. We're sharing stories. And in this case, we're even sharing songs, just like our ancestors from long ago. And as we hold this vision in our hearts and our minds of being gathered around the fire, I'd like to take this moment for Mary and I to call in the spirit of our ancestors and our guides to be in this conversation with us, so that their wisdom can flow through us and we can share what's most meaningful to share. So I'd like to call in my Irish lineage and paying special homage to my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Dunlap, and her mother, Catherine O'Boyle, and that beautiful matriarchal lineage. And I welcome them into this space. And I feel Elizabeth's courage at her decision to move to America when she was 17 and start a new life for herself, leaving behind everything that she knew. And she never saw her family again. And so I really honor her bravery, and I feel her in this space with us. And she was from the north of Ireland, so feels very relevant to our conversation today about the Ulster sean-nós tradition, which Mary has been lovingly teaching me the past few months. So I call in my matriarchal lineage of Ireland. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Míle buíochas. And with that, I'll pass over to you, Mary.
I'd like to call in the Dagda, a mythical god of music with a magic harp, and many, many stories about him. I'd like to call in the goddess Bridget, because she is one of the greatest blessings of this country. And on a personal level, some of the singers that have inspired me, Sheila Gallagher, who passed away in the 50s, I believe, Mary McLaughlin Kelly. These are northern singers. Mary McLaughlin Kelly, who was the last known keener in the north of Ireland, in the Armagh, in the Oriel area. Yeah, and on a very personal level, my great uncle James, who apparently specialized in 22-verse songs. I never had the privilege to meet him, but I always feel that he's somehow with me.
Thank you so much, Mary. I love that you called in Bridget. She's one of my beloved guides, which some of you, the listeners, will know. And the title of this episode is Sacred Song Traditions of Ireland. And really the first thing to say is that Ireland has such an incredibly rich culture and heritage when it comes to music, and especially traditional music. And perhaps not everyone would describe traditional music as sacred music, but this is really how I perceive and experience it, because the songs are passed down through the generations. And, you know, these songs tell stories about history and culture and really connect us to that beautiful through line of memory. And, you know, sacred songs have been important to our ancestors throughout history and all around the world. And it's an important aspect of cultural identity. It brings people together in community, and the act of singing and sounding gives us the opportunity to transcend into non-ordinary states of consciousness and connect with something so much greater than ourselves. You know, sacred songs can be incredibly healing and liberating, and they can really invite us into the feeling aspect of ourselves that really gets us out of our heads and into our hearts. And just before I pass over to Mary, I just want to mention that I've just started taking Irish singing lessons with Mary over the past few months, and she's really the most wonderful teacher. And Mary, I'm just so honored to have you here with us today. So, Mary, my first question for you is, you know, I'd just love to hear a little bit about your personal story How did you become a singer, songwriter, teacher, preserving and passing on these important traditional ancestral songs?
Well, it's very interesting what you were saying, this idea of singing being sacred. And more importantly, singing bringing you to a transcendental sort of a state. I would say that I've always sung. I know my grandmother used to say that when I was little, I just used to sing and dance all around the place continually. From my own inside internal experience, it was quite simple. When I sang, I was happy. It was as simple as that. And it was, and I lived in a very fraught, I'm a child of the Troubles, in Northern Ireland. So, a lot of my life was pre-war and war, basically. And my life in Ireland when I was a young person. And, it was a scary place. And I was being a sensitive, I was picking up that fear all the time, not knowing what it was, This was further sort of bolstered by a fairly brutal school system, I have to say. So fear was never very far away from me. But if I sang, I was like Dorothy in the Yellow Brick Road, If I sang, I didn't feel scared. And I remember thinking that. So it was always an incredibly important piece of who I am. In terms of this particular path that I have landed on, that began for me when I was 11, when I went to the Gaeltacht, which is the Irish-speaking area in Donegal. I went there to learn Irish at the age of 11. I was there for 3 weeks on an intensive course. I had 3 words, which wouldn't have got anybody very far. But the idea was that, I would be immersed and would learn like that. I heard for the first time at singing in the sean-nós. I'll talk about that a little bit later, what that means. But I heard that for the first time. And the only way I can describe it is my soul awoke. Now, I was always quite spiritual. I was always very spiritual. I was always going out and making little altars and all that stuff. But I was very much following the dictates of the Catholic religion that I had been born into. This was a different feeling. This was like this incredible feeling, which I wasn't able to name or articulate. All I know is at the end of the 3 weeks, I went home, and before I went into the house, where there's a lot of younger children and a lot of hurly-burly, and I knew it was all going to dissipate. And I went to a tree, and I have to tell you, tree hugging wasn't particularly big in Northern Ireland all those years ago. But I instinctively went to this tree in our garden and put my arms around it, and I whispered into the tree, "I have a secret feeling." And it was my way of kind of preserving it. And through the years, I would sort of touch that tree to remind me. And I went and then announced to my mother that I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be, I quote, a famous Irish singer. She looked completely horrified. She'd expected me to say something like, at the very least a teacher, something very kind of academic, She said, "You can't do that. You'll never make any money doing that." Well, she was right. I'm not going to say that she wasn't right, because she was right. But it was for me the beginning of this path. And I made it work through doing day jobs as well. But I managed to work at that. I ended up doing all of those in the arts too. So I took some years to get it streamlined, but I managed it. I moved to London when I was 18 to do a BA at London University in English literature. And my guitar came with me. My guitar never left my side from the time I got it when I was 13 until, I still have one that's 35 years old. First thing that's packed, first thing that's unpacked. And so it's very important. That's really, my instrument. It's almost like a symbol of who I am. So I went through lots of different stages, I trained informally in the natural voice method in the 90s with Frankie Armstrong, which was amazing. And then I began to teach voice workshop, helping people locate their voice. I was living in London. The Irish wasn't very popular then, it was a really dangerous time. So I was focusing really on voice rather than the Irish stuff. When I moved to the States, that completely changed, because suddenly there's this totally different emphasis, and suddenly people wanted to know me because I was Irish, which was a brand new experience for me. And that's when I really dug into my Irish stuff. So I would go back over to the Gaeltacht every year from America and keep in touch with my Gaelic friends, and just developed through that. And then one thing led to another and another and another. And meanwhile, I was writing for Myth mostly. My first song that I recorded, which was in the late 80s, was about the Children of Lear, which is my favorite myth from childhood. And, you know, I write a lot from myth and you know, sort of, if you like, drawing on the myth to understand our own psychology. Because it took me a little while, and then I realized, oh, these are all about me. You know, they're all about me. And that it's true that every writer in any genre is always writing to some extent about themselves, but you hope to write in a way that is going to reach other people, that is encapsulating archetypes and symbolism and metaphors that other people can come in at their level with, you know. The sacred song thing, I would say I was always a sacred singer because I always loved religious music. And it's a very interesting, I've been thinking about it quite a bit. What does it actually mean, this idea of sacred song? And we just talked about the act. But in terms of repertoire, I think it's more specific. I think it has to be specific because otherwise it gets lost. And sacred for me is very bound up with ritual. And ritual is about form, and it's about creating a container, and it has got a clear beginning, clear middle, clear end, but more than anything, it has a clear intent. So the intent is an incredibly powerful driver in all ritual. And so sacred song for me is that which is connected to ritual or recalls ritual of some kind. And the other piece I would say about sacred song, which I think is very important, and it's actually a key piece of ritual, there has to be a shift. There has to be a shift in mood. There has to be a shift in understanding. There has to be an uplifting of some kind. Even with the saddest songs, the Keens, which are the saddest songs, they are incredibly sacred songs. And there is a movement through the Keens. I do courses in the Keens, and there is a gradual movement of what happens. It helps people. It helps guide people through a grief process to be more uplifted at the end. So I think that sacred has always been a huge thing for me, although I didn't always name it like that. And then in the last, I would say, 10, 11 years, I've really focused in very much on the sacred. The Cór Gleek project was about that, really. It was about singing sacred song in Gaelic. And so I had a choir. I had about 2 people, I think, who were really, really good Irish speakers when we started, 2, maybe 3, and about 20 people who had never actually spoken any Irish. And we did only Gaelic. So it was an amazingly brave thing for some of them to do, and it was very uplifting. It was a wonderful 7 years, I have to say. And then I introduced the Latin chant as well into that, because that is a huge piece of influence in Ireland.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, Mary. So many golden nuggets in what you just shared. That was so gorgeous. I love that you brought in the mythic aspect of your path and your work, and it's something that I do a lot of teaching about. And yeah, lots of my online members and things, you know, we talk about exactly what you said, you know, drawing on the myth to understand our own psychology. Somebody actually wrote that in the comments because it was really profound.
Yeah.
And I love the intention and the ritual, and so beautiful. So my next question for you, Mary, I think it would be really informative for everyone if you could share a little bit about the different kinds of traditional music from Ireland. So sean-nós singing, the keening, the ballads, you know, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many. So I'm just gonna I'm gonna let you go with that, because I know there's a lot to share.
Yeah, I think the best way to think about it is, you know those family trees you see, you know, where there's, you know, 2 names at the top, and then vertical lines and then horizontal lines as they branch out. I think that's one of the best ways to think about the tradition. So the line at the top says sean-nós. It means old style. It's a phrase that was coined in 1904, and it referred to music that was acceptable in the Oireachtas, which was the Gaelic-speaking singing competition. So what was happening in the late 1800s in Ireland, the old music, the old way of singing was changing. There was a Gaelic revival. And there were other influences coming in. There were Anglo influences coming in. There were American influences coming in. And all of those were beginning to affect the music. So it was changing from what it had been into more what they call parlor music. The sitting around the piano sort of a thing. That's not typically or traditionally an Irish thing. It's much more Anglo. So the Oireachtas were these, you may have heard of the Flacciol or the Fashion or any of those things, those competitions. And this Gaelic, purely Gaelic. And they would have, of course, all sorts of dancing and instrumentals as well. But in terms of the singing, they decided that the only way they could fairly judge was to have certain criteria. And those criteria, they dubbed sean-nós, old style. So the criteria were that it was A, the song was in Gaelic. B, it was sung unaccompanied. C, there were certain conventions that were used which were acceptable within that tradition of singing. Certain ways of singing, a slight nasalization. Sometimes, a singer would begin with a little hum to place the note, those kinds of things. So there's quite a few sort of these conventions that came in, but I really named the most important ones, which is the Gaelic and the unaccompanied. So then that's the style of singing. So when we talk about sean-nós, so that's our first line. But when we talk about that, we've got our two vertical lines. And the first one, that little horizontal line, is style. So that's the way you sing. And so that'll apply even to English language songs. And that's what happened in the last 50 years. English language songs are sung in that way. They're sung with a certain amount of ornamentation. They're sung with sometimes the nasalization. They are now accompanied and they're sung in harmony, but there are those basic conventions in there. On this side of our line, we've got repertoire. And so I say that sean-nós repertoire, what I understand by it is the older repertoire in Irish. And so by the older repertoire, I really do mean pre-1900. Pre the 1900s. But yeah, that's sort of, that to me is how you kind of separate those two out. Now, underneath that, you can put many, many more lines. And I would start with themes. So if it's sung in the sean-nós, or if it comes from that particular repertoire, then, that there are going to be these themes. And the themes are the themes of any tradition. There's love, there's loss, there's death, there's arguing, there's politics, there's humor, there's drinking, there's poverty, there's jealousy, there's, all of human life is in there. Of course, a big theme in Irish tradition is emigration, because it was a massive, massive piece of our history was emigration. And so there are a lot of emigration songs, and some both from the point of view of the emigrant and from the point of view of the immigrant. So, there's a lot of that sort of stuff as well. It's a huge, huge area. There are so many songs. And as I say, I would say the pure sean-nós, pretty much anything that was composed in Irish before the 1900s or something. And the sean-nós style has gone right through the 20th century, right into the 21st century. And it seems to be something that we all sort of just learn by osmosis here. So an Irish singer will almost naturally sing in a certain style. Having said that, as I've discussed with you a few times, Tara, there are 3 dialects of Irish, and there are 3 styles of singing that go with each dialect. And so in terms of that, I come from the Ulster tradition, which is the sparsest of the singing traditions. We don't ornament so heavily as the other traditions. Our tradition is closer to Scotland because we're geographically closer. So we're only 14 miles from Scotland at the tip of Ireland. We're actually very, very close. And there's huge amounts of interchange backwards and forwards and all this sort of stuff. And they were also preserved a Gaelic culture. So their Gaelic culture and our Gaelic culture quite often, have got mixed up. The further you go down south, the farther it gets away from Ulster. So the Connacht tradition is the most floral of the traditions. Joe Heaney is the emblematic singer there. There's Roisin El Safdie's a contemporary singer there. Wonderful, wonderful singers. And if you listen to them, they're very heavily ornamented in terms of, they're like this ornate gate, you know, it's beautiful patterns and everything twining in. The Kerry and the Munster style is between the Ulster and the Connacht, leaning more heavy towards Connacht. Again, they have got a lot of ornamentation there of the melismatic style type, beg pardon, but not quite as ornate as Connacht. And as I say, as we get up, our variation is different because we emphasize more glottal stops and which are just sudden stops in the middle of a song, which are quite dramatic when you do it. We emphasize those. We also emphasize rhythmic stretches or rhythmic syncopation and melodic shifts. So we'll move the note around. So I'll give you a little example of what I mean by that. I have the 3 kinds of ornamentation in this because so it's like this is the quiz part. Spot which ornament I'm using. Is it melodic, rhythmic, or melismatic? You know, that's the sort of the thing. So I'm going to use just the first line, and this actually happened to me. It's the first line of a song. I was at a workshop years and years ago in Derry, and it was about sean-nós. And there were 5 men there who were sean-nós singers from the area. Everybody else had come in from Canada, Australia, the States, whatever. And so I was co-running it with Frankie Armstrong. So she had brought them through a lot of vocal stuff and then sort of went over to me for the sean-nós. And I thought, oh my goodness me, I have 5 absolute experts here. Now, part of the sean-nós too is about protocol. You know, you bow to your mentors, you bow to your teachers, you respect them, and you don't push yourself forward. You know, that's part of the protocol. So I immediately turned to these 5 guys and said, look, I'd like you to demonstrate how you sing. And I asked them to just sing the first verse of a very well-known song called She Moved Through the Fair, which is a beautiful song about a revenant. And the 5 of them in turn just did the first line. I'm just going to give you the first line, but pretty much this is what happened. Number 1. My young love said to me, my mother won't mind. 2. My young love said to me, my mother won't mind. Number 3. My young love said to me, my mother won't mind. My young love said to me, my mother won't mind. 5. My young love said to me, my mother won't mind. Now, each one of those is sung in the sean-nós. So you begin to get how incredibly complex this is. And that's why people get confused. Because they're thinking, well, that's sean-nós. How can that, which sounds so different, also be sean-nós? But if you realize that we're talking about a style of singing which has certain conventions, and those conventions are movable, they're not fixed like classical music. You must do a mordant on, meter 4, exactly in the middle, using these 3 notes, very fixed. No, it's not like that. It's very much responding to your own heart's connection, which is probably why I've always been so in love with this particular tradition, because it so connects to the heart, to the individual. And that's one of the reasons why sean-nós is sung solo and unaccompanied. Because if you're really doing it from the heart, it takes a brilliant accompanist to know where you're going to go to next. Because you might do it one day that first way that I did it, and the second day, the 5th way. So does that kind of clarify that a bit?
Yes. Oh my gosh, Mary. Wow. I just want to First of all, I just want to read you some of these comments because they're so lovely. Someone just said, wow. And then another person said, wow, with like all capitals. And then someone else here said, heart melted into my soul. And someone else has said, chills. Just so beautiful, Mary, to receive. And, it just feels like these songs are alive. That's really what I was getting when you were speaking.
That's key, Tara. That's the exact word. We call it a living tradition.
Yeah.
And, once it's stuck on a bit of paper, it's dead in certain ways. So you have to revive it. I certainly have come across a thing where people will say, but that's wrong. I say, why do you say that? It's not the way it was in the book. I said, that does apply to classical music. Absolutely. But in traditional music, it's not about how somebody else did it. It's about how you take it and do it. But the key is, and that's the sacred piece, within the conventions, so that you're not just branching out totally. And it ceases to be within that tradition. It then becomes fusion, which is a wonderful thing in its own right. I mean, some of my favorite bands in the world are fusion bands. And I love the experimental stuff that can go on between cultures. The Afro-Celts were one of my favorite ever bands. Eel is another very favorite band of mine. And so those groups and singers too, who experiment. And there's a marvelous singer, Indian singer, Sheila. No, I've forgotten her second name. And she brought Indian music and Irish music together because she had an Indian mother and an Irish father. And it's absolutely stunning what she's done, because she brought them together in a brilliant way. And she herself is a wonderful singer. She started out singing with a group called Monsoon and way back, and then she discovered this path for herself. Sheila Chandra, amazing singer. So I love fusion, but I also like to be clear about what we're doing. And I mean, I will experiment with lots of things. All my own albums are multi-track. That's not sean-nós. But I use some sean-nós songs, and I also use the style because it's so much in me to sing that way. But then I'll have instrumentation going on. I will have harmony going on. I do my own tracks because nobody else could possibly follow me because I'm totally irregular. But I can follow myself. So that kind of a thing. Yeah, living tradition. It's important to remember that, but remember that it's within the conventions, within the ritual.
Yeah, like honoring the past and the way that the songs have been passed down while also allowing it to be alive. Yeah, that's really what
And I always say about text, the best way to get into a text is to consider, what did that composer mean? Everybody, and any songwriter will know this, any writer will know this, you write from your own experience. You write from your own emotions. You write from the landscape around you, whatever it happens to be. And to just touch that piece when somebody else has written a song, and then somehow you've got to take that and make that your own. So I always say, look for the core emotion, look for the core feeling that's in there. Look for the core message, whatever it is, and then deliver that message in your way. And that's the skilled part of it, if you like. But mimicry isn't going to do it. Mimicry is not going to work. However, you can't really learn the conventions and the framework unless you mimic. So certainly as children, when we were introduced to this, it was very much osmosis. And I would say to anybody, immerse yourself, listen to lots of people singing. You'll begin to then feel, you get into that pool. Then you begin to swim with them, in your own way. So they're all doing the front crawl, you all do the back crawl, it's fine, but at least you're in the pool,
Mm-hmm.
All those things are desperately important. Otherwise, it just sounds false.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that when it is written down, people often think that's the date of composition. It's usually not with the tradition. It's usually the date of collection. And so by the time that collector has actually collected that song, it could be 200 years old. It could be 2 hours old, because you don't actually, it's just gone into the community and the collector has collected it, So That's another important piece to remember when looking at songs, especially written down ones. And what will have happened is the collector will have written down what he or she heard at that point in time from a particular singer. Another singer 5 minutes away would have sung that song differently. That's what allows the spaciousness of it all.
Yeah, you were telling me that story the other day of how there was a point, I think it was in the 1940s, correct me if I'm wrong, where they were collecting lots of these traditional songs and they would pay by the verse. Maybe you could just say a little bit about that because it's so interesting.
Collections began in the 1800s. Well, they began in the 1600s, but really came up big in the 1800s, where you have big collections of marvelous resources. P.W. Joyce, George Petrie, they were collecting around by the 1850s, and they were going around the countryside collecting songs, and they were also classically trained, so they were transcribing the songs, but they were putting them into diatonic. Now, these songs, the old songs, are not diatonic, they're modal. So to try to capture them in a different scale is very difficult. On top of that, they're arrhythmic. And so, I remember hearing about one collector going around and tearing his hair out because the first meter was in, 2/4 time, the second bar was in 6/8 time, the third bar was in 9/16. He was going, where is this song going? You can't apply those metrical sort of divisions. You just can't do it to these songs. But the only way you can write down is to standardize them to a certain extent. So people have thought for a long time, how do you actually transcribe these songs in sean-nós? I personally, the way I did, I learned, because I did my master's in chant, most of that was Latin plain chant. I did what the monks did and used neumes, which aren't notes, but which are little symbols which give you a clue. You go up here, you hold here, you go down here, you do a twiddle here, but it doesn't tell you how long you hold for or how high you go up. But when I was learning a song, that was one way I would remember it, by just notating it like that. Then, audio came into being in, I suppose, in the 1930s, really, but sort of made its way to Ireland in the 1940s. And the collectors were working for the RTE, the Radio Air, and the State Irish recording broadcasting station. But at that point, what was happening was they were paying the singers, which was great. And there was a lot of competition in the Girl Talks, there was sort of friendly competition and not so friendly competition. Some of it was, I know more verses than you do of that song, so I should be singing it. And others were that, I'm going to get paid more for 9 verses than 3 verses. That was happening as well. I know some of the repertoire I've got have come from those collections, and it's just a marvelous, marvelous resource that we have. I'm I'm absolutely not knocking it, and I just think that it is great that they were rewarded. I told you, I'm going to tell you a very funny little story. It's a true story. My mother told me so, therefore it must be true. My great uncle James was a singer, and he was a farmer basically, but he sang. So they would have these parties, and she said, whoever he was dancing, singing, was great till he started on one of his 22 verse ballads, and off he'd go, and we'd all fall asleep. Somebody, and I'm not sure who it was, she told me the story, and I have tried to find out who it was, and I haven't managed it, came to record him. And about 2 weeks later, he received a letter in the post with a check for £30. Now, this was, I believe, end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s. That was a lot of money. He didn't understand what a check was. He didn't even have a bank account. He thought it was a bill for the privilege of having sung on the radio. And he dressed himself up in his best suit. He was in Leitrim, that's where he lived, and took himself down to Dublin in the train and went to the offices and knocked on the door and handed it and said, I'm terribly sorry, I don't have the money to pay this bill. It's a check. And he said, what am I supposed to do with that? I don't have a bank account. If that happened in my family, I don't know how many of these happened, because money was a rare commodity. I don't blame people for... I'd probably been out there singing 20 verses myself if I thought it was going to make me a bit of money and I could buy a pair of shoes, What do I always think contextually around these things?
Wow, such a great story, Mary. And yeah, I love that through our conversation, you're bringing in some of the history of Ireland just through, through your personal lived experience of these songs. And one of my next questions for you is, why does the traditional music play such an important role in the cultural traditions and history of Ireland? And I know that's a big question.
One is the ancestral piece, and I think this is true of all traditions. It's a hotline to the ancestors. It's like this marvelous golden line, this thread that's gone through. And we live in different ages and times, but ultimately humans don't alter that much. We have computers. A couple of hundred years ago, the printing press was invented. When I went to school, we wrote with pens, and I had an inkwell. Technology certainly develops, but the humans don't really change that much. These, we all feel we have exactly what the song's about, love and loss and all of those things today. And so the songs that last are the ones that encapsulate, like I said earlier, the archetypes, things that are common that go way beyond race, time, space, gender, goes way beyond that. And they're the archetypal feelings. So we all feel intense love when we see a little baby. We all feel intense sorrow when we bury a loved one. So it's those intense feelings, they're all archetypal. And a lot of those contained within the mythical stories, like I mentioned earlier as well. So I think there's that line of the archetypes coming through, and we relate to it. Isolation, being the Cinderella, being the one that's always doing the work where everybody else is always having the fun. All of those different archetypes come through in these songs. So that's one piece. In Ireland specifically, a very big political piece. Remembering that Ireland was subject to invasions. The Celts were invaders. The Celts came 750 BC. They were civilization here before. Civilization here, I think it's 20,000 years now they've discovered wall carvings in Ireland. You can't walk in Ireland for more than a mile without tripping over a monument of some kind or falling down a monument, And those were built 6,000 years ago, So we don't know much about those populations because there wasn't literacy and it was all just oral, and that was a lot of the myths came from there as well. And it was a way of keeping the traditions and the songs, the myths, all of that stuff. Then the Celts came about 750 BC. And they brought their stories and songs. And of course, they took over all of the British Islands. The particular race of Celts that came to Ireland were the Gaels. And they also went to Scotland. And they were called the Q Celts. And, Tara, you're doing a fantastic job on the Irish language. But, it can trip you up sometimes with that sound, Screach. And so there's that, and it's got influences of Hebrew, influences of Middle Eastern, influences of Punjabi. Then, that's in there. Then the Christians came and they brought literacy. And I never underestimate the tremendous contribution to Irish culture. Next invasion were what we called the Vikings, and they were Danish, the ones that came to Ireland. They seem to have integrated very well. Having said that, my name is McLaughlin. That means son of the Viking. And my father's people came from the Inishowen Peninsula in Donegal. And every second person is McLaughlin up there. The Vikings would go to water. So they went to Inishowen, which is on the coast. And they also went to Dublin. Duvlin means black pool, and it's a Viking name. The actual name in Irish for Dublin is Ballyclea, town on the River Lagan. It's not Duvlin. But they also seemed to settle in and assimilate. And, so we know that there's Danish and Celtic heritage here. But then the next invasion was the English, who decided to colonize. Now, there already had been lots of interchange. We're not that far away from England, and there was lots of interchange between England and Ireland. Lots of trading went on. The Romans never came here. They invaded England, and remember, there was all that Roman and Anglo and Pictish and all that stuff all happening in England. So they were also an amalgam of invasions. But Henry VIII, made the decision that he wanted to colonize Ireland. And so that began with him. And then, of course, it went exponentially. Well, the Irish weren't very happy about this. And the Irish, by this point, were a mixture of people, like I say. But they were bonding together and working together in community. So one of the things that happened was they clung fiercely to their language and to their culture. So it is like this raft in the middle of this tidal wave. So that's why I think it's so very, very strong. There's the two pieces going on. It's the connection to the ancestors and it's the connection to the past, but it's also a political statement. This is who we are, and we're not who you are. We can definitely tolerate each other and we can definitely be together, but we're not the same. There's a huge amount of similarity. And I will say here that what happened again in the 1800s, particularly when broadsides were those big balance sheets. It's like the Sun newspaper, it's like it's one of those papers. It's got everything, but it'll also have, the latest news, from wherever, and it'll also have recipes, and it'll have maybe some fashion advice from the 1700s or something like that, and it'll have a song or two. So, these were amazing. They were big pieces of paper, and they would squish it on there. And then balladeers would stand at fairs, and they would sing the song and then sell the broadside so that they could actually live. They were hawkers. They were buskers. Again, what happened was some people who bought the broadside were literate in the 1800s. Others weren't. So people would hear them singing and they'd hear the tune and they thought, really like that tune. They'd go home. They either wouldn't have the broadside or they couldn't read it, and they'd make up their own words to the tune. Or there might be another song that they knew the words to and they didn't like the tune. So they'd do a little swapping there. That was another thing that happened. And that's one of the reasons that we have maybe 5 or 6 songs to the same tune in different parts of Ireland. So it's not right, wrong. Nobody knows where it really began. It was all this transmission happening all the time. Plus the English, Scottish, Irish working people were always intermingling because there'd be potato picking in Scotland and berry picking in Scotland. They'd be fishing around the Irish Sea and going over to Liverpool, going on the big boats to America. There'd be, back and forth wherever the work was. And they'd be swapping stories and swapping songs. So you find a lot of the child ballads that are basically Scottish come into the Irish repertoire. But these are all English languages of the late 1800s. So I always say, if you're not sure, see if it's in Gaelic. If it's in Gaelic before 1900, it's probably, almost certainly, sean-nós. There are a few English ones that come in as well. But even then, they probably came from England on a broadside and then were changed. Then the details were changed to make it be from Ireland. So and it's all in there, So there's this, not just this past line, but this interconnection of these islands, and the acknowledgement at some level that we actually do have an awful lot in common.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was so beautiful to receive that wisdom. And there was just one thing I wanted to add on to what you were saying, because it seems similar, because you were telling me when I was learning the song Go Molto Brigia, that's when people would hear the songs in church in Latin, and then they'd go home and make their own make up their own song, but with the melody, right? So yeah, I just thought that was another interesting.
Well, that's another interesting piece, because Latin, like coming back to the monks, the Latin plain chant is so important in the Irish tradition, and going back to the 500s, this when Patrick was doing his mission here, he wasn't the first to come here, but he was the one that made the most impression. And he was the person who was responsible for most of it, of the spreading of Christianity. The monks were Irish. So they were bringing their own cultural knowledge to the compositions that they were making. And so many of the early chants were composed by Irish monks. The Medievita, which is one of my most favorite ever chants, Latin chants, was composed in Switzerland by Blessed Notker, who was Irish, and that was in 870. Columkill was singing Ibunt Sancti, which was called Celtic chant, one of the Celtic chants in the 500s. There's this marvellous story of him coming in with his monks into Glasgow to meet Bishop Kentigern, and they met each other doing ad alteratum like monks do. So, Ibunt Sancti de virtute in virtutem. There'll be one group of monks, and the other would sing back, Alleluia, Alleluia. It's a wonderful song. And this was the early Celtic chant. And I think it gives us a key to what was happening musically in Ireland at that time. Because we've got rather overcome by Gregorian chant, which was later, where it was collected and standardized. And that's what Gregorian chant is, standardized chant to line in with Rome. And it was political. It was about keeping the Roman emperor happy. And so people now think that is the only chant. There was this whole body of Celtic chant, most of which has been lost. But that Ibunt Sancti is one of the few that's remained, and it gives us a chant. It's totally different to the very, grave 12th from 13th century plain chant, which is very beautiful and exquisite, but it's totally different to the Celtic chant. I just love it. I've always loved chant. And it is very meditative. But it was in Latin, and, there was a sort of an elitism, so that people would go to church and they'd be cordoned off, and they didn't speak Latin. And they'd hear these gorgeous tunes. And they want to sing that. Go Multa Brigia is a great example, because that's where there's a marvelous fusion of pre-Christian and Christian going on. Bridget was a goddess, beloved, one of the goddesses who was totally beloved in this land. And then there was a Saint Bridget named for her, and she was totally beloved, this abbess of Kildare. And so the two became very fused. So, there is no doubt that the nun Bridget did miracles. There is no doubt that the goddess Bridget did magic. There was this. So the two just became very fused, and Bridget came to signify certain things. So Go Multa Brigia was taken. The plain chant was Ave Stella Maris, Hail Mary, Star of the Sea, and so it was a chant to Blessed Mother Mary, which was the Roman Catholic lexicon, if you like. And Bridget was Mary of the Gales. So she didn't have her song. So they took the Latin plain chant, somebody round about probably the 1700s, we think, but not absolutely sure when it happened. But they took this 13th century plain chant and set the set of words about Bridget to it. And my favorite verse, I think, as I've shared with you, in Bridget is the last verse, where the concepts are brought together, where it says, on Bridget's day, the Irish spring is coming. And that's the pagan festival of Imbolc, which is also, of course, on Bridget's day, because, the Christianity was a bloodless coup here. And one of the reasons for that was that it was very, very clever what happened. Instead of going in all sabers rattling, they said, leave the monuments where they are. These people go to their wells. These people go to their mountains. They have places. Places very important in Ireland. So there were sacred places people would go to worship. Just gradually over time, change the icons. So they will gradually come to appreciate and worship Christian icons. That's why you have this interesting synthesis happening, because that's the way it was done in the 6th century. It took about 100 years. It was a very, very clever way of taking over a whole set of beliefs. But people didn't want to let go of those, but this allowed them then to have their pagan beliefs and their Christian beliefs. And there really wasn't that much of a clash there. It sort of lay well together. I think it was a very smart move myself.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I love how Christianity and paganism weave together so beautifully in Ireland, because at first glance they might seem like two completely separate things, but they're really not, as you just beautifully expressed. And that was actually one of my questions for you, but you already answered it, which was wonderful. So thank you for saying that.
As well is the fairy faith. I mean, because that's pagan. The fairy faith is pagan. But you will find here that, nobody's going to cross the fairies. And they could be the most devout religious person. But they're not going to cross the fairies because there's been too much lived experience of what happens if you go and tear up a hawthorn bush in the middle of a field. It's not a good plan.
Mm-hmm.
So the two, that's the other piece of this. So fairy faith is still very strong here. But it's done in secret. My mother would preface sentences with it. Of course, I don't believe in such things, but they do say, and then she'd tell me this wonderful story, about fairy faith, And so it was this kind of weird way of passing on information. It's not true, but, and it's this duality, which is very charming and also very confusing to visitors to the country.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I know we have lots of people listening who either have visited Ireland or want to visit Ireland or come back to Ireland. Lots of people from North America. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm just seeing the time, and we're getting close to the end here. So I just have a couple more questions. The first question is a question from someone who's listening, and they're asking, I have a question about the Dullaman song. What is your relationship to this song?
Well, Dullaman is a Donegal song, and it's about two seaweed gatherers who are basically courting a young girl. That's what the song's about. And so they're having a bit of a friendly competition. There are two types of seaweed, the edible seaweed and the inedible seaweed. So the Dullaman Wearach is the inedible seaweed gatherer, and Dullaman Rearach is the edible seaweed gatherer. I think that's the way of it. And so, they'll have one, he'll say one thing, he'll say another. Oh, I'm going to go and I'm going to buy you a new pair of shoes. And she says, oh, I'll come with you and I'll get a new pair of shoes. And I haven't got the words in front of me right now, but it's basically, that's what the song is about. It's great. It's a real fun song. It's not to be taken too seriously. It starts off with, oh, daughter, look, there are two men over there courting. And she says, quick, get me my fishing reel. You can make what you like of that. But it's a song that I love, and it's kind of got that chanty feeling to it. There are a few different versions of it, a few different verses. The one I know is Annie and Vino can all of hurry. Awa her Vino, Carmarapple and the Gme, Dulaman the Binyagui, Dulaman de la, Dulaman the Faragusha Barabi and Aaron. I mean, that's the version I know. And then I know Celtic Women did a different version, and Clannad did a different version. So, there's lots of different versions. Like I was saying, people like the song and then change it a little bit.
Beautiful. Thank you for answering that. I hope whoever asked that question, that answers what you were asking. Okay, so my last question for you is, what is your favorite traditional Irish song and why? What's the story behind the song? And also, could you sing it for us?
Oh my goodness me, how long have you got? Right, okay. Well, you've hit a very important thing, the story behind the song. Crucial. It's called the Udaran Aron. It's the authentication of the song. It's what right do you have to sing the song that somebody else wrote? And the right you have is, in my opinion, and what this word means, this phrase, Udaran Aron means, is that you've done your research about it. You've found out who did write it. And if you don't know that, what do you know about it? So a lot of them come down of, we don't know who wrote them. And a singer will actually introduce it like that. We don't know who wrote it. But it came from a particular area. My favorite song And I have quite a few, actually. I make a policy of not singing songs that I don't like, so I have quite a few. But my very favorite one is a fairy song. And it's one of the few songs that is claimed to have been actually sung by the fairies. And it's called Colin Jas Cruchinamo, which means the pretty girl milking the cow. And the story that goes with it, and this comes from Tory Island, right up on the tip of Ireland, 9 miles out from Donegal. And the story that goes with it is that a man, well, he wasn't particularly young, but a man was dying on the island, and a young relative was sent to the priest to come and give him the last rites. It was late at night, so Jimmy, the relative, ran to the priest's house and battered on the door and said, "Father, come quick, my cousin's dying." So the priest gathered all his bits, the oils and candles and everything, and he started out. And Jimmy said, "Let's cut through," or the priest said, "Let's cut through this field here." And Jimmy said, "No, we can't go there. It's nearly midnight." And the priest said, "So?" And he said, "Well, it's a fairy field. There's a fairy fort in the middle of it. We cannot go through that field." And the priest said, "I'm having none of that nonsense. A lot of nonsense. Don't believe any of it. We are going through the field as quickest." And he started pacing off, and Jimmy ran after him rather reluctantly. And as they came to about the middle of the field, and just as it got to midnight, they heard in the fairy fort, which is a natural enclosure, it's hedges round a mound. And they heard the sweetest singing they'd ever heard. And suddenly the priest just stopped, and he became totally, utterly entranced. And it was like he was being pulled on the thread, and he just headed towards a gap in this hedge. And Jimmy was shaking him, couldn't get through to him. The man was like under hypnosis. So Jimmy follows him. They get in, and in the gap, they saw fire. And by the fire, there were 2 very small red men, no bigger than your fist. And they were holding hands, and they were holding a gaze, and they were singing this song to each other by the fire. They didn't bother about the priest. They weren't interested. They just kept going. And they stood there and they listened, and they stopped singing, and they still didn't look. They were still holding hands and still holding the gaze and taking no notice of Jimmy or the priest. The priest shook himself and said, "What are we doing? What are we doing?" And ran out, and Jimmy followed, and they ran. They got to the house, and they arrived just as the man had died. Well, of course, Jimmy told everybody what had happened. And there was a strong belief at that time that the fairies were in league with the devil. So the next thing was that people began to say that the fairies had stopped the priest coming to save the man's soul so that they could catch it. And that they had these Mastini Moor, the big mastiffs going around in the ether looking for souls on their way to heaven. So the song, as I say, this particular song's from Donegal. By the time it got down to the south of Ireland, it had changed completely. And it was much more about the devil than it was about the fairies. And the words had changed, etc. So this is the song that I know that is from the Donegal, that goes with that story, called The Priest's Tale. And it's basically just a very sweet love song where these 2, saying, "Pretty girl milking the cow, I saw her, the most beautiful creature in the world. If only she could come and be mine. And her parents won't let me near her. And if they did, I would make her mine." And there are lots of clues that they're singing about a fairy woman. The milky skin, the cherry lips. These are all fairy images. I could go on about that another time. Anyway, this is it. And Colin Jas Cruchinamo.
Hi everyone, I'm just dropping in with a quick post-interview note that Mary and I have decided to include the official recorded version of this song on Cailín das Cruchinamo, which is from Mary's album Sacred Days, Mythic Ways on Rowan Records 2012. The vocals are Mary McLaughlin, guitar, Bruce Adams, cello, Aria DeSalvio, harp, Steve Coulter, nickel harpa, Era Frankfurter. All arrangements Mary McLaughlin Publishing, BMI. And you can purchase this song on iTunes. August Jack. Look a good Alicia young. Sudam Gregya Moke Trano da Kriya words and Excaputres per you. This is Jericho grew and all our prayers. So Tabeli is milcham smerha. It's a skill, you know, the snow. Neil is just shows until show. No, just I'm bold. Sean spare my royalish force. It's the shot of Rona Ulster. God with Frank and 7 years control. Neither so listen of green or a minchin. Listen, yes, or me and alone. I'll go back on the Tillium and winter. On that Oh, wow, Mary. Thank you so much. That was so beautiful.
I always think it's a very magical song.
Yeah, I could feel the magic like coming through so clearly. And this is a great place, Mary, for you to just tell everyone where they can find you. Someone wanted you to talk about your upcoming keening workshops. So feel free just to spend the next few minutes telling people about where to find you and what kind of things you've got available.
So the best thing to do is to go to my website, www.marymclaughlin.com. It's spelled like Laughlin, it's pronounced Lough, Laughlin, McLaughlin, marymclaughlin.com. I also have a Facebook page which people follow, and the link is all the links from the front, the home page. And the Keen course that I use 12 weeks, it's in 2 parts. The first part is very much the history. It's kind of lecture based. I use slideshow and come back, do some discussion, etc. It's takes it right from, way thousands of years ago. We go from there, we started as near the beginning as we can get to, and then move up into the present day with that particular tradition and how it's developed and evolved and all the rest of it. So it's open to anybody. I play some keens on it, but it's not a singing course. Okay. However, the second part 2, and these are separate parts for this reason. The second part is a singing course. You do not have to go on to part 2 if you've done part 1, but you can't do part 2 without doing part 1. The reason that I do that is I'm going to be teaching the keens that I've talked about in part 1. And I don't want to spend most of the time going into the history of the keens because they're not easy. They're really not easy. And so it's really sort of an hour and a half of intense singing, and you have to be able to sing. It's not for people who are brand new, who, would like to just dip their toe in. You've actually got to be able to sing because they're too hard otherwise. And you get defeated, and I don't like that. I like people to succeed. So that's a sort of a quick thing about it. The registration is open at the minute. The next one begins August the 7th. It is filling up. The registration is open, and the way to do it, this is to go to my website, and you will see there's a special drop-down menu at the top, and there's contact. And in the contact, you just write to me and ask me for a flyer that you're interested in the keen, and I'll send you out then flyers. So you can do that as well. And then the next course that I'm going to be running will be the Gaelic Christmas course, which is very different. And that's very joyous songs. It's all about Christmas. That I'm not too bothered about the singing, you can join in sort of thing. Although some of them are more complex than others. All my singing courses are, if a Gaelic song is not the easiest thing to sing, is it, Tara? So it's if you don't have to worry about the singing part of it, then you can focus on the Gaelic part of it. That's what I always say. So that's basically what's coming up. And I haven't got to the 22 courses yet because I've been just too busy this year to do it. But I'll be doing another fairy course. I've just finished one of fairy song. Now, the one I've just sung is not one of the ones I teach because that would take an entire 6 weeks to teach. So they are a bit simpler, but, I may be doing next year a complex one where I will teach a couple of these more complex ones. Haven't decided yet. So the best thing to do is go on the website, then aside from my newsletter, that's crucial. At the bottom of the website, there's a newsletter page. Sign up for that because you'll always get information about registration first on the newsletter. You'll get some of my thoughts about various festivals. I tend to write about festivals and myths and things like that there as well. And follow me on the Facebook thing. So I think that's the best.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary, for sharing that with everyone. And I've been doing one-on-one lessons with Mary, and that's just been such a gift. And you're such a natural teacher, Mary. And yeah, I appreciate you so much. You've been listening to Dreaming the Ancestors with Tara Brading. My passion is connecting women to the wisdom of their ancestors, specializing in ancestral feminine wisdom from Ireland and England. If you feel called to connect with your Irish ancestry in an embodied, spiritual, feminine way, I lovingly invite you to sign up for my free reclamation journey, which includes a 90-minute video to connect with your Irish ancestry and ancient heritage. And if you hear the call to connect with your English ancestry, I have a 3-hour introductory workshop called Women of the Wells. You can find these offerings at tara-wild.com/get started. To spell that out, that's TARA-WILD.com/get started.